I'd like you to take a look at something today. I'd like you to think of something that you think would make you better, make you a better person. Maybe it's something that you've already put into place and you already have a plan of action to make that happen. Or maybe it's something that you've experienced defeat with and a hard time in bringing about. Doesn't matter what it is. I want you to think about it and consider that perhaps what you're looking to accomplish and what you're looking to achieve within yourself may not be the course of action that is necessary for you to follow to accomplish what it is that you desire. Now, inevitably, to come to this conclusion, you have to have some degree of self-evaluation. You have to have some degree of being intuitive to understand who you are and what it is that you would need to try to meet that goal and meet those needs. So here's what I want you to look at. Is your critique of yourself correct? Did you misdiagnose what it is that you need to get to that threshold that you personally feel you need to reach? And as I mentioned, all of these variables come into play because it's necessary that we see ourselves. You have to be intuitive, but that is very difficult to do. It's hard to see yourself. Example, when you get an opportunity to hear yourself recorded and it's played back, a person's natural response is, oh, wow, that's the way my voice sounds. Or perhaps you see yourself on tape or on video. It's uncomfortable because in your own mind's eye, you look differently, you move differently. And the sound of your ear, as the voice comes out of your mouth, you sound differently. But when you hear it as others hear it, it was not the way you saw it. Another example is a TV show that I used to enjoy. An example of how it's difficult to see yourself. Now this TV show, as I'm explaining it, may sound a little salacious. It is not. You may think that I found this show entertaining because of some other aspect about me. This is not the case. The name of the show is called How to Look Good Naked. The show is aimed at women, so the strong demographic pertains to women. And the show addresses a woman's sense of body image. The show will begin each episode with a different woman of varying sizes, varying body size. She is then asked to strip down to her bra and undergarments. And then she is placed before a line of other women who have done the same, wearing nothing but a bra and undergarments from size 0 all the way to size 20. And then they say to this woman, you go place yourself in that line where you feel you belong. So let's say this woman is a size 10. You would think she would go stand between the woman that is a size 8 and a size 10. But what often happens is this woman will go and stand, say, between size 16 and size 18, because that's how she saw herself, which will prompt the host to walk up to her, grab her by the hand, and bring her down the line and say, you're supposed to be here. Now, these other women that are standing there, they don't look unattractive at all, nor do they look heavy-set or unappealing. And mind you, this is going all the way up to size 20 and more. And the woman's reaction is challenged because that's not how she saw herself. So you would think that how can it be so difficult to be you and yet not see yourself? God has said that the heart is deceitful above all things, who can know it? Dr. Seuss has says, today you are you. That is truer than true. There is no one alive that is more youer than you. With that being the case, where does the difficulty come from in seeing who we are, in being able to see ourselves? When we look at the Bible, do we see ourselves in the Bible? And I do not necessarily mean introspectively per se. But when we look at the societies of the Bible, we see societies that reach levels of separation from God, that reach levels of degrees of sin that was so strong they had to be destroyed. And when we look at that, we go, oh, that was back then. That doesn't pertain to us. We're not like that. And yet, the level of sin that they carried on may have been to a lesser degree than the way our world is carrying on right now.
Yes.
I propose that if our world were in existence back then, we would have been wiped out with the
Yes.
way that we're living.
I agree.
So we look at the Bible and we have difficulty in ascribing what we're seeing there on paper to what we have here today. And we live in a world where we don't attribute these things. We look at television and the commercials that come in. Commercial after commercial after commercial is all about achieving some item or thing or service that will complete you. So commercials, media, television, phones and internet, things have expanded so much so that it's global now. The reach of our society and the ways of thinking and the influence of it is very far-reaching to adults and to children, such that now in this world it could be entertained of having a global market when that was not considered possible before. The Tower of Babel was destroyed when man began to coalesce too quickly and perhaps lead into ways of life that were not appropriate too soon. And yet today, even though languages are different, that is no longer a barrier. So we look at these commercials and the way things and suggestions are pumped at us, and not just commercials, but media in general. And what happens is we are offered an evaluation of what we might need or should want. And then we are given the solution. This is how you obtain it. And this is what is affecting our minds and our ways of thinking. And in this process, these commercials, this popular sense of view doesn't seem to recognize the other difficulties and problems that we have. A lot of us personally have had experienced death in our family, or perhaps family members that have been sick. And when you watch these commercials, you see everyone having a good time. They're at Red Lobsters and they're at Fridays enjoying that microwave food that was made in the back, and it's delicious. And they're going out and they're buying these cars and they're going surfing and they're doing this and they're having this item and they're eating bandy camps at home and they're enjoying dinner with family and having soda and beer, so on and so forth. And yet there's no mention of anything about death, which kind of resonates with you when you've experienced it, and then you turn around and you turn on the television and it's so heavy on your mind and you're so conscious of it, and yet there's not one mention of it on the screen, on the television, in the music, and the radio. No one is aware that this epidemic is going on, and everyone is dying and will die. Not a mention. People don't see themselves. And so when we look at ourselves, do we see ourselves in that? And do we see ourselves in the pages of the Bible as we look at some of these examples? So starting off, let's turn to Genesis in chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 11. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And this is reflective of what's happening in our world today and the way we're living. Continuing on, and God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So things got to the point where God could no longer tolerate the way people were living. And so the world was destroyed, and that society with it. When I was younger, there was a phrase that we would use, and you would hear it quite often. And it was, you could take the person out the hood, but you can't take the hood out the person. And the concept behind that is you can take a person out of an improper and imbalanced environment, but what you can't do is take that imbalanced environment and mentality out of the mind. You can remove the person, but this is hard to change.
Yeah.
And this is what we are challenged to change.
Yeah.
This here is what is the issue. And this is what is being addressed in the pages of the Bible.
Yeah.
So, continuing on in chapter 9 and verse 21, we find now the world has been destroyed. And we have people that will now begin to repopulate the world. And here we find Noah in time began to cultivate the land and grow grapes and grow something to drink, and he made wine, and he had too much to drink. Continuing on in verse 21 of chapter 9, then he drank of the wine and was drunk and became uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. Now, this passage is ambiguous, and it's hard to initially understand what is being spoken of. I could say what isn't being spoken of. Oftentimes, you will have people take this verse and attribute it to a group of people that may have been disenfranchised and claim that because of certain things that happened in history, that disenfranchisement is justified. That is not the case. It's misdirected. So, continuing on. So Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him. Younger son meaning not Ham, which is what most people might think, but Canaan. Canaan was the younger son of Ham. That is what that line is referring to. What happened was that evil world had been destroyed. But as I said, the world was still in the minds of some of the individuals that were still remaining. And the fluidness of living, the ways of thinking and their attitudes and worldviews and ways of religion and things like that, that was still present. And so what this is a reference to is a reference of Canaan sodomizing Noah. And as I said, it's ambiguous. But in that society like ours, these practices are viewed differently. They may seem to be accepted and embraced and championed. And so we have somebody taken out of a certain element, but that element was not taken out of them. And this may have happened some 20, 30 years afterwards, because at this point, Canaan has reached a point of accountability. He may have been a child when he entered that ark, but now he's a man after some time has passed, and yet his belief system, his ways of thinking are still present in the mind. Matthew 24, verse 38. Here Christ is reflecting on the way people thought and lived during the time that civilization was destroyed in Noah's day. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came. They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. That's what we do. We have a corrupt society, and yet we still practice eating and drinking and getting married.
Yes, sir.
So how is our civilization any different from the one that was destroyed. And herein lies the challenge for us to see ourselves in this story. In yet another story, moving up to Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9, and this is the story of Lot and his family, which many of us are already familiar with. And it shows a family that has been so affected by the world around them. Could they see the changes that were happening? Oftentimes, it was criticized, particularly with Lot, is not only did he subject himself to being in this environment, but it's often criticized that his mindset became so contaminated that his balance and sense of right and wrong was thrown askew. And this is challenged when we see how the mob came to the home of Lot when he had entertained guests that had come to the city. And Lot comes out of his home and he tries to plead with the crowd not to do so unrighteously with the men, who, quite frankly, to sodomize them. That was where their lust was going. And so Lot offers up his two daughters, virgin daughters that didn't know men. And people think, what's wrong with this guy? How could he do such a thing? To that end, it does sound a bit much, but I'd like to just share with you, there is another point of view that is not highly accepted or entertained, but I find it very interesting. Perhaps Lot had no intentions of giving his two virgin daughters to the mob. He may very well have been placating the mob, the same way we would placate or see people placated at a bar, or if we're dealing with someone that's drunk. They've had too much to drink. They don't want to leave. They want another drink. And in turn, what would we offer them? Why don't you have a cup of coffee? I don't want coffee. Well, I'm sorry, that's all I got. Well, forget it then. And then they leave. Lot may have very well known the appetites of those men. They didn't want any girls. They didn't want a woman. This is very possible he had no intention of sharing his two daughters to be gang raped by these men. He may very well have been placating them. Needless to say, the effect of this on him and his family, allowing his family to commingle to this degree, perhaps co-marry with others from the city, it took its toll. In chapter 9, starting in verse 21, we see after they've been removed, again, you can take the person out of the environment, but you can't take the environment out of the person. So here we find, then he drank of the wine in verse 21, and was drunk and became uncovered in his tent. I didn't move down to chapter 9, or did I? I did.
Yeah, you explored.
Well, let's see. I didn't jump down to the story of Lot, and I don't want to take the time to skim through to find it. Needless to say, what we find is his two daughters, they concerned themselves that they were the last people on earth. And because of that, what they chose to do was get Lot drunk and then sleep with their father so that they could be impregnated. Now, the mindset for them to do that shows that they had been greatly influenced by the environment that they just came out of. That world, that society was destroyed, but what they retained was ways of behaving and interacting, ways of having relationships that were corrupt and still astray from God.
Yes, sir.
Now, the Jewish commentaries will champion these women and say that they were doing something noble and trying to extend their family. But again, the effect of that society and how it affected the ways of thinking is reflected in what they chose to do. So what we find is, because of this, we need to put out some sort of degree of resistance to deal with this.
Yep.
and understand that it isn't merely our environment that's at issue, but our way of thinking. And to challenge our way of thinking, we have to use God's Spirit.
Amen.
In order to use God's Spirit, we have to continuously employ what we've been given, that portion, earn more, and become stronger in using it.
Amen.
It is necessary to do this through prayer, study, resistance, endurance, repeat. That is the only way this can be done. We are unable to do this of our own power. We must pray. We must study. We must attempt to live right and resist the wrong way. We must endure the discomfort that we will have to deal with in trying to do that. And then repeat. Do that all over again. This process is how we are to live. This is what is necessary to ensure that we can see ourselves so that we have the right attitude. How many of us might bring a pet into our homes, particularly if you have children? What you're looking for is a certain type of disposition, not merely to remove that animal, perhaps a dog, out of the shelter system, the environment that it was in, or out of the crate that you got it from, or the other home that you took it from to bring into your home. No, what you're looking for is a certain disposition, a mindset, a behavior, where that animal is going to carry itself properly, particularly around your children. So if you have young children, and this is a big dog or a small dog, if this child were to be childlike and aggravate the dog, you would want that dog to resist any wrong responses and endure the child pulling on its ears, smacking it in its nose, and taking a bowl of water and dumping it over its head, and still not responding in the wrong way. Until someone came and intervened, you wanted that dog to have a certain disposition. The dog that acts like that is the dog you want to bring home. Herein again, we need to have a certain degree of thinking and living using God's Spirit, and this is what God is looking for in us. How is it that we would expect behavior from a dog and yet not institute it in ourselves?
Amen.
Ephesians 6, in verse 12. Here we read, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." What this is reflecting on is that our struggle, our resistance, these things are taking place in our mind. The battlefield is our mind. Again, we're taking that nature that's within us, the influences of society and this world, out of our mind, as it's challenged by God's Spirit and that way of thinking. But so often is the case, we are unable to see these needs, these proclivities that we may have to the world. An example of this is the story of Samson. The story of Samson would be a physical incarnation of the things that take place spiritually, that enables us to see it in real action as it's played out, to see the intangible workings that would happen in our mind as we're using God's Spirit in real life. Now, oftentimes, the story of Samson is relayed in children's stories. He is portrayed as a superhero, and so on and so forth. And then that meaning, that understanding is lost as a mere fable of entertainment. That is not the case. So let's turn to Judges in chapter 13. And here in chapter 13 of Judges, starting in verse 1. Again, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. So the Israelites were subjected to the Philistines. They were kind of under their heel, under their rule, under Philistine occupation. And this was a result of them culturally and religiously not abiding by God's way of life, and hence they were placed in subjection of the Philistines, unable to rule themselves outright. And we're introduced to the parents of Samson, and here this woman is approached and informed that she would in time have a child that was going to initiate the deliverance of their people from the Philistines. Continuing in verse 2, now there was a certain man from Zorah of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, indeed now you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Now that phrase, angel of the Lord, a lot of times this phrase is ambiguous also, and some find it challenging to determine whether it's referring to an angel or if indeed is an example of man having an interaction with God, if it is Yahweh. And if you read the different occasions where this takes place, there are occasions where it's very striking that it is not an angel when you see the conversation that is taking place, or you see some of the behaviors that take place after it. That is not necessarily something that I'm going to concentrate on now, but I mention it because I find it very interesting. Secondly, this messenger continues to talk to the woman and later the parents and explain to them that this child was to be raised under the Nazirite vow. The Nazirite vow was a vow that usually had a time period of a certain allotment, but for Samson, it was a lifetime. He was unable to cut his hair. He was unable to drink wine or have any grape products. And he was supposed to live by a certain standard. Another Nazirite is Samuel, the prophet Samuel. Many may not realize that he was a Nazirite, but he was. And so, a lot of times when you picture Samson, you may picture a man with, bulked up on steroids with muscles. That may not have been the case. He may have been an ordinary looking guy, because remember, it was the power of God that infused him, not his own physical strength. Secondly, his hair. Many, particularly people from our community, may look at him and give him dreadlocks. But remember, the degree of coarseness of their hair may have been different. And so what was happening was they would braid their hair into 7 large braids. And oftentimes what they would do is what people do today that may have dreads, that are a little bit more cosmetic about it as opposed to adhering to a certain lifestyle like many may see in the Caribbean. They'll take their hair and they'll roll it up kind of like in a beehive style. And that's how they get around. And this is the way Samson more than likely carried himself and how he looked. Continuing on, so this messenger explains to the parents that they will have a child and that will initiate the release from the difficulties that they have with the Philistines. It wasn't a complete removal, but it certainly initiated things so that by the time of David, the Philistines were thrown off, and there were never a problem the way they had been all the way up until that point in the history of Israel. And this was the beginning of it. Secondly, as far as an example of how we would relate to Samson, his coming on the scene was projected before he was born. Much the same way the church's coming on the scene was projected before the individual people that have been called into this were brought into it. It was already understood that there was a role that needed to be fulfilled. Somebody was going to fill it. And God moved to select this family, this individual, to take on that responsibility. Just like each and every one of us have been selected to carry this responsibility and utilize God's Spirit in this manner to change our mindset using His Spirit. So continuing on through chapter 13 and skimming through it, they acknowledge this, and dropping down to verse 24 in chapter 13. So the woman bore a son and called his name Samson. And the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him at Manaah Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. The Tanakh version has that the Spirit of the Lord first moved him in the encampment of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. Meaning, what the sentence is saying is at this point, at some point, the Spirit of God initiated something that imbued him with feats of strength. Much the same way the Spirit, or at least it became more revealed to people at large when Christ changed water into wine. And he told his mother, it's not time for X, Y, and Z to happen yet. And yet she was still pushing him to do this. So this is when Samson's first display of these abilities began to take place. And without a doubt, he was well known for it by the Israelites and the Philistines. Continuing now in chapter 14. Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah, the daughters of the Philistines. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah, the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. Back in those days, when you wanted to get married, the parents facilitated the marriage. And there was usually a Bowery exchange, meaning some monies were exchanged for the transference of one woman in one family to another. And this is what he's telling his parents. And what his parents follow with is the same thing that we are being challenged with here today. Can you see yourself? And basically, the questions that they pose to him are essentially that. Do you see yourself? Do you see what you're doing? Do you see what you're exposing yourself to? Continuing in verse 3, then his father and mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren, or among all my people, that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? The prospect of marrying outside, not so much your race, not so much your culture, but marrying outside your religion, was that it would affect, again, your mindset and change this and make you worship other gods, change your mental state, your drives, your ambitions, your influences to the wrong thing. And yet, as we go through this story, Samson continuously is placing himself in that situation. Much the same way we are exposed to a sinful world, exposed to these influences, and yet we keep toying with them. We keep going back to them. We keep thinking, we recognize we're special, we're okay. We recognize that, yes, we should have a certain mindset, but I feel fine now. A lot of times young people, when they start to drink, they do not know how to pace themselves and what is going to come in the near future. And so they drink. And then they go, I feel fine. You feel fine now, but in 15 minutes, you may not be able to carry yourself the way you want.
That's right.
Unfortunately, many of us have learned this through experience. But when it comes to the spiritual way of living, you have to look at that forecast and recognize you could subject yourself to so much before you become tarnished and fall prey to that way of thinking. We may look at ourselves and how healthy we are. And you may take a young man that's 20 years old, and he can walk outside in 20-degree weather in the dead of winter and go to the car and get the groceries out and bring it back up with no shirt on, and he'll be fine. His resistance may be stronger than others, but were he to stay outside for an extended period of time, he will get sick. Then you take another person who may be older, where maybe their immune system has been compromised, and they do the same thing he just did. That little trip will wipe them out. They are at a different point. Each of us may be at a different point spiritually, but that does not mean you literally place yourself in harm's way thinking, I can handle this, I'm going to be okay. Because the day is going to come when you won't be okay.
That's right.
The day is going to come where your reserves have been depleted unbeknownst to you, and now sin has crept into your mindset and changed your direction. This is what Samson is doing with himself, and this is another reflection that we can see in how we would live spiritually in his example. So, needless to say, his parents acquiesce. They go approach this family, and they make arrangements so that Samson could carry through with the marriage. So now in chapter 14 and verse 5. So Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came to the vineyards of Timnah. They go to this area. And at some point, Samson is off by himself. Now, to his surprise, in verse 5, or the middle of verse 5, a young lion came roaring against him. The Tanakh version has a full-grown lion. So a full-grown lion comes on him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. Throughout the retelling of this story, that phrase, "and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him," is often used in an introductory fashion before some display of strength that's powered by God's Spirit. And he tore the lion apart as one would have torn apart a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. And this was physical evidence of what he was able to do and accomplish using God's Spirit. The same way that we too would use God's Spirit through feats of strength, but in an intangible way, in our minds, in our character.
Yeah.
This is what we've been challenged to do.
Amen.
1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8 says the devil is a roaring lion. We have to use God's Spirit, and in this power that we see carried out in a physical way with Samson, we have to do that spiritually with the atmospheres and environments that we're in. So after he does this, he continues on, and he spoke nothing of it to anyone. A period of time goes by. So the betrothal period is like a year. That's how the Jews practiced things. They didn't just get married. There was a year where there was what we would call like an engagement period. And so nearly a year has gone by, and as we continue in the story, Samson returns to see what is called his wife. They called each other husband and wife at that point, even though the marriage had not been consummated. You would look at the story of Joseph and Mary. When Joseph found out that Mary was pregnant, he assumed, okay, things have been going on. I don't want to embarrass her. I'm going to divorce her outside of public view. That was during that betrothal period, that year. And that's what's happening here. So during this year, Samson returns to see the woman, and there's a party that he throws that's customary, perhaps to celebrate the engagement. And on his way there, he passes the carcass that he killed. And inside this carcass, it had already decomposed a good deal, and there was honeycomb inside, and lots of honeybees had made a nest inside. And he took some of this and ate, but it becomes a point later on in the story. So he continues on, and he has a party or a family gathering or some sort of festivities. And at these festivities, it has here chapter 14, verse 11. And it happened when they saw him that they brought 30 companions to be with him. The Philistines are aware of Samson's strength and his behavior, and they brought 30 dudes to the party to make sure nothing jumps off. That's what those guys are there for, primarily. And a lot of times Samson is looked at, and oftentimes we think that there's some dalliances going on, that he's not living quite right. We look at the fact that he killed so many people, he's not supposed to touch dead bodies as a Nazirite. Or he took honey from the lion, and that's a dead body, but their vow is more so with people than animals. And then there are other things that'll come up as I pass it, I'll touch on it. His greatest fault, though, was that he allowed himself to drift and be exposed to sinful influences in much the same way we would in the way that we live. So he goes to this party, he poses a riddle to his guests, which was something that was often done as entertainment, and in exchange, if they could guess the riddle, he would give them 30 pieces of very expensive clothes. And if they couldn't guess it, they in turn would give him 30 pieces of very expensive clothes. And as it played out, these Philistines, they sought to find out the answer to this riddle. And so they threatened his wife and her family. And what happens then, in verse 16 of chapter 14, then Samson's wife wept on him and said, "You only hate me, you do not love me. You have posed a riddle to the sons of my people, but you have not explained it to me." Samson continues, and he said to her, "Look, I have not explained it to my father or my mother, so should I explain it to you?" At this time, the family structure was such, your mother and father, you were very close to them. But he didn't share this with his wife. He didn't share this with his girl. And what did she do? She pressed him for it. She nagged at him. She wept on him. She pulled at his emotions much the same way sin does with us. It pulls at us. It morphs itself into looking like it's not so bad. It's for our own good. It can be beneficial to us. And these influences begin to change the way we think. And again, this is what's happening to Samson and what he allowed to continue to happen to him. Needless to say, he eventually shared this with her. And he let her know what the answer was. And she went and told her people. They went and told that to Samson. And now he's pressed to follow through and give 30 garments that was agreed upon at this riddle. And in verse 19 of chapter 14, again we read, "Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily." Again, these are physical attributes, but these are the same qualities that are taking place in us when we're thinking, when we're dealing with a hard time, when we have influences upon us or thoughts come into our mind. This power, this Spirit of the Lord will come on us mightily and act on how we're thinking and behaving. So the Spirit came on him, and what does he do? He goes and he kills 30 guys, and he takes their clothes. And then he turns around and he gives them the clothes that were agreed upon. And this kind of back and forth, tit for tat stuff is what happens over years with the Philistines. They, in turn, would do things to him to hurt him. And needless to say, Samson would retaliate. So he gets so upset at what happened, so upset that this woman kind of let him down, like sin will do, that it doesn't meet your expectations like sin will do. And he stepped away for a while. And then later he comes back to see his wife. He's assuming the engagement is still on. And what had happened was the father gave her to someone else that was supposed to be his best man in the wedding. Probably one of those 30 guys that had been sent there to make sure he didn't act up. So Samson again was furious, and he does some damage. He seeks to damage property. And he gets some foxes together, and he ties their two tails together. And he got a lot of foxes. Foxes are not easy to catch. They don't hang out in bunches. It took some effort to do this. And who's to say that some, again, miraculous feats of speed and such were at play here to do that. He ties two foxes together. He ties a torch to their tail, sets it on fire, and sets the foxes loose, and much damage is done. The Philistines, in turn, they find out who's done this, and they see the correlation between Samson and the woman that he was supposed to marry. And they go and they kill that woman, and they kill her father. And in turn, Samson retaliates and went on a killing spree, killing a lot of people. Again, the Spirit of God comes on him, and he's able to set these things in motion. So, in retaliation, the Philistines gather a lot of men and they come after him. Samson retreats to his country. And the Philistines, when they enter the area that the Jews live in, the Jews are now questioning, what's the problem? Why are you coming here with so many people? And they explain they want Samson. They're not looking for anything else. They just want Samson to return the favor. So the Jews bargain with them, let us go get him, and we'll bring him to you. And so they do. And Samson goes with them quietly. He doesn't want to fight or hurt his own people. They agree that they won't kill him themselves, but they will let him loose with the Philistines. And so they do that in chapter 15, verse 14. They get to a certain area. He's already bound with ropes. He voluntarily came with them. And they set him out, and he's walking on his way. And this whole group of 1,000 Philistines are now waiting, and they charge him. And at this point, as is often relayed in the story here, then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, the way it does with us when we utilize God's Spirit. And he in turn kills 1,000 people. These are the kind of things that Samson is doing physically with the power that he has. And as you go through the story and go through the other chapters, he continues to do this over and over and over again. There is a point here in chapter 16 where you find that Samson goes to a prostitute. Now, chances are, the way it's translated is as if there was some sort of sexual dalliance there. And that also may not have been the case. The phrase "he came to her" can merely mean that he went into that area. It is used in Joshua chapter 4, verse 22, where you have a general chasing somebody. The same phrase is translated that he went in to the tent. He didn't go in to sleep with anybody, he went into the tent. A lot of times during this period, when you went into another city and you wanted to be undetected, you would go to the prostitute, stay there. Nobody was going to look for you there. You're kind of incognito, you're undercover, no one's paying you any mind. When Joshua sent 2 men to scout out Jericho, that's what they did. They went and hid out at the prostitute's house. And it just so happened that prostitute Rahab converted and was moved by the Israelites' God. But same wording is at play in Joshua 4, verse 22, and in that example that I gave. So it's very possible Samson came to this area, as he often did, scouting it out, looking for women, coming there socially, but he may not have gone there to be with a prostitute, but he went there simply to have a place to stay that evening undetected, because he was very well known, and it's kind of like enemy number one. And even following this, another feat of God's strength comes on him, and he takes a gate and removes it, walks miles with it. Continuously this is shown. And then we get to a point where we encounter the story of Samson and Delilah, where several times he's in her company and he's confiding in her to a degree. There's a degree of resistance where he doesn't completely share his secret, and she is pressing him for that. In chapter 16, verse 4, afterward it happened that he loved the woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him, which is exactly what sin does with us. It's meant to entice. And they went to her and they wanted her to entice him. And so, incident after incident, she would ask, what is the source of your power? And he would tell her, but not full disclosure. And she would tie him up in some means by whatever he means that he shared with her. And he would have to fight his way off. The Spirit of God would come on him. As I mentioned, that 20-year-old walking out into that 20-degree weather, he's okay doing that. He comes back. He can fight that off. The same way we may place ourselves in certain situations and fight that off, but we shouldn't be there. We're toying with, we're getting too close to the edge. And it could eventually take its course. And eventually that's what happens with Samson. Dropping down to verse 10 in chapter 16, then Delilah said to Samson, "Look, you have mocked me and told me lies. Now please tell me what you may be bound with." And over, he kept lying to her. Then he gets to a point where he tells her the truth. Verse 16 of chapter 16, "And it came to pass when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him, the way sin does, daily, doesn't take a break, it's always on you. You expose yourself to that way of thinking. It doesn't leave. And it isn't just your physical locale, it's your thinking. It's your mind, it's there in you. So that his soul was vexed from all of this, vexed to death, that he told her all his heart." That's what we do with sin, with the wrong way of thinking. We give our heart to it. We open up completely, thinking it's going to encompass us, comfort us, and make us whole, and it doesn't. It lets us down each and every time. The way all of these relationships with these Philistine women did. And yet, he still had enough power where he could get himself out of it. We place ourselves in this way of thinking during the week. We get to service on Saturday, and maybe we're okay. But if we do enough prayer and study and resistance and endurance and repeat, but sometimes that gets interrupted. Sometimes that mentality and that sin taxes us, so we stop. And we get to a point where we crack, we fall, we give in like Samson did. Verse 18, "When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines. And of course they came, they tied him up, they captured him, and they took his eyes out. And that's what happens to us. Our eyes are taken out. We're unable to see ourselves, which is the topic at hand. Can you see yourself? We're unable to see as a result of this exposure. He was unable to see. Like the 5 virgins, they were unable to adequately see what they needed to do in response to the bridegroom coming, in response to the things that will initiate Christ's return and the unsettling things that will happen in the world. Those 5 virgins, half of the church, do not know what to do. The way Samson, the position he was in, being unable to see. And you know the rest of the story. He was later taken captive, and then he was brought out for entertainment. And he eventually had a little bit of power come back, and he called on God. And he was able to bring the building down on everyone that he was in. And in so doing, 3,000 Philistines died. But they weren't just normal people. You had, in a sense, you had the president, the vice president, all the Secretary of State and all the ruling people there. That initiated the heel of the Philistines on the Israelites to be loosened. And so we see this example physically of how God's Spirit is used and how we would use it in ourselves and in our thinking and in our attitudes. And then we return to the world that we're in, to the mindset that we're in, to the attitudes that we're exposed to, and the things that we chase in trying to make a better life for ourselves during this time. Do we see ourselves? Can we see ourselves in the midst of what we're in? Is it possible that it is rubbed off on us like the people that we looked at in these stories? And if it has, could we see it? What is it that we're looking for that would complete us? What is it that would make us a better person? And this is the pursuit that we have. This country was built on that. It was built on these attitudes, on the pursuit of happiness and liberty. This is what man is looked at as having be what's just his right. So when we do that, what are some of the things that we might feel are necessary? How do we see ourselves? What is it that we're looking for? As you see, I wrote some things here on the board. And some of these things may be reflective of perhaps what we are looking for, of what we might need, of what we feel is important for us. And so, some of it is kind of small, but I could read it to you if you can't see it. And the first one, our natural inclinations, our attitudes, the things that we want out of life. Pay attention to yourself. How important is that when we're living, to pay attention to yourself? Because who else is going to do it? Your health, your sense of sanity, even degrees of accomplishment, your career, your family. These are things that we want the best for. This is the way we're thinking. These are the things we have to balance in this world. Secondly, be financially secure. Who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want a 401k? Who doesn't want to make sure they have enough money to function and do the things they need to do, and perhaps have some leisure to be able to invest in their children? Third, acknowledge your achievements. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want this sense of accomplishment. Is that wrong? This is something that we naturally seek. And we take all of these things combined, and this is how we may chase those attributes that we think will complete us or help us get there. 4, have confidence. Again, this is what we're all looking for, because many of us have been hurt. Many of us have been scolded in some way or another. And so as we look to better ourselves, emotionally we try to protect ourselves. And this is another means of doing that. 5, disregard detractors. People will try to pull you away from what you are trying to achieve, from how you are trying to see yourself. Unhinge yourself from oppressive relationships. There are people that they don't see it for you. They don't see what you're trying to do. They don't believe in what you could be, and they will speak against it. Establish yourself without being in anyone's debt. Everybody wants to be able to accomplish what they need to without being reliant on someone else. They want to be able to provide for their own. 8, be progressive. A lot of times we are stuck to the old ways, and in so doing, you might handicap yourself. You want to look at some of the other ways of doing things and employ that. Just because it's new doesn't mean it's wrong. This is the mentality that people will use. Be stoic. As I said, many of us have been hurt and scarred. Nobody goes through life unscathed. And so being stoic is a way of managing your emotions and yet still being able to accomplish what you need to. 10, don't be lenient with ill treatment. Many people place themselves in a situation where they're getting treatment that is not conducive to health. Perhaps you're in a job you can't stand. Perhaps your boss is just nagging you, is making you sick to go to work. These are the environments that people find themselves in. Indict the wrongdoings around us. We see things around us that are not right. We see people living in ways that aren't correct, and we recognize that. We may share it with others. We may just keep it to ourselves, but recognize this isn't appropriate. Don't limit yourself. Again, think outside the box. Think that you may be able to accomplish certain things with what you have access to. Be assertive. Again, pushing on and pushing forward with what you might be able to achieve. Intolerant of closed-mindedness, seeing that certain things are possible even though others might not see it. Disconnect from relationships that are toxic. Again, under the heel of people that aren't allowing you to grow and move forward. Be adamant. You have to be in tune with what it is that you're trying to do and stick to it. You can't give up, even if people are trying to dissuade you. Have dignity, a sense of consciousness about yourself, and you hold or you see yourself in a certain way. Number 18, be zestful about life and all that life has to offer. These are promotions that we want. We want to enjoy these things. And lastly, recognize God. These are things that we can't help but do as we live life. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, do you see yourself on this board? Do you see yourself here? Can you see yourself? And that is the challenge. Being able to see yourself for good or bad. And it's hard to do that. So, we compare this to attributes in the world, to the pulls of this world, and what we have pulling us in the opposite direction. And we can find that in 2 Timothy 3, chapter 1 through 5. Second Timothy 3, chapter 1 through 5.
Verse 1.
Verse 1 through 5. And so we see what we are exposed to in the world. What we see, that resistance that we are to have against other things, and how it can affect our mindset. And so the question is, do you see yourself? So, chapter 3, verse 1, but know this, that in the last days, the days that we are living in, perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves.
Yes.
Pay attention to yourself, remember? This is what many of us say. Yes, we do that. Men will be lovers of themselves. This is what we were championing and looking at. But did you see yourself?
Yep.
Did you see that in paying attention to yourself, if you were to take God out of that equation in turn, what will that morph into? Being lovers of yourself. Being lovers of money. Be financially secure. Again, take God out of the picture. And this turns into what we have here in 2 Timothy, that pull of the world. Do you see yourself? Continuing on, number 3, boasters, acknowledge your achievements. 4, being proud, have confidence. 5, blasphemers, disregard detractors, even if it's God. Even if the Bible says, don't live like that. This is the influence of this world. Do you see yourself? Continuing on, number 6, disobedient to parents, unhinge yourself from oppressive relationships. How many children want to do that from their parents? Number 7, being unthankful, establish yourself without being in anyone's debt. This is the pull of the world, and this is what we may find ourselves doing. But these two lists are the same. My question, do you see yourself? Continuing on. Number 8, unholy, be progressive. Even if it's new. It doesn't matter who you love. It doesn't matter if you're the same sex, as long as you have love to share. Continuing on. Number 9, be stoic. Being unemotional, here in the list that Paul relays, it's unloving. Continuing on. Men in the last days will be number 11. Number 10, unforgiving. Don't be lenient with ill treatment. Again, how many of us acknowledge, yes, I could see myself in that. But in Paul's list, do you see yourself as being unforgiving? In the last days, men will be 11, slanderers, indict the wrongdoings around us. You see what the guy next to you is doing. You see how your neighbor is running out at night with his wife. You know he's probably gay. And continuing on. Number 12, without self-control. Don't limit yourself. 13, in the last days, men will be brutal, be assertive. Men will be despisers of good, intolerant of closed-mindedness here on this list. In the last days, men will be traitors, disconnect from relationships that are toxic. No need to be loyal to anyone. Why? It doesn't suit you. Do you see yourself? In the last days, men will be headstrong. Number 16, be adamant. Men will be haughty, have dignity. You're better than that. You don't need to come to church and mingle with those people. You don't need to live in that neighborhood around those guys. You're better than that. You went to Ivy League school, or you're in a completely different tax bracket. You don't need to associate with them. Haughtiness, have dignity, take God out the picture, and it morphs into this. Do you see yourself? In the last days, men will be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Be zestful about life and all that life has to offer. That's what will happen when you take God out of the picture. And lastly, 19. In the last days, men will have a form of godliness but denying its power. And so, people will recognize God. Denying its power. The power that Samson was using. The power that we would use in our own mind.
Amen.
This list, which is the same as this list, the world uses this list, and they don't have the power. And what we see is, when we read of all the saints in the Catholic Church, this is the list they had. They recognized God, but they didn't have the power. So, I ask you, can you see yourself? Which list do you see yourself on? Because this list, I'm on, and I seem to get some degree of affirmation from you as I was speaking. It's the same list as in 2 Timothy that people will have in the last days. And so, what we need to do, the proper way, is found in Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5, verse 22. The power of God enables us to accomplish these things. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Aw, that's so sweet. These are not sentiments. This is supposed to be power. There's supposed to be power in this. But then if you look at it just from the point of sentimental value, what good is joy and peace going to do against a lion? There's no contest. You'll be torn apart. What good will joy and peace do you in the grittiness of New York City when you're on the trains, dealing with different pulls and attitudes? What good will joy and peace do you when in the recesses of your mind there is some morsel of lust brewing? When that gets out of control and becomes evident, well, there goes your marriage. There goes your sense of self. There perhaps potentially goes your relationship with God. When all of these things are coming into play, what good are these little sentiments? They have no value without the power. That power that we saw Samson use is the same power that we would use to fight off the lust of the flesh and the pride of life. That's what these lists are. That's what we have to take out of our mind. And that's what we're supposed to see. And I ask again, do you see yourself? Revelation 10, chapter 7. Revelation 10, chapter 7. Revelation 10, verse 7. But in the days of the sounding of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, the mystery of God would be finished. Ultimately, I ask, do you see yourself? It's something that no one else can see. It's something that no one else even knows is going on. The world at large doesn't know what's going on. People in general that may know us they don't know this is happening within our minds. It's a mystery. At the seventh trump, that mystery becomes rather clear. It's not a mystery anymore. What we are supposed to become will become evident. But in the meantime, what we're supposed to do is be able to see ourselves so that we can get to that point. It's important to see yourself. It's important to recognize what it is that we are to be so that we can change. And you see, it's very hard to recognize who you are, even though you are who you are. So, I hope that we're able to see things a little bit differently and see the power we're supposed to use and how relevant it is and how difficult it is to recognize at first. But if we use God's Spirit, we'll be able to see.